Change is in the air, my friends, and a new podcast calls for a new jingle, and it's in the works. I'm your host, Sylva Florence, and this is Magic, Medicine, and Mayhem. In February of 2021, I was contacted by a man named Sam Stern. Sam is a retired OSU or Oregon State University professor who was doing research and writing a book about the impact of the daily scholarship. And it's since been published. It's called Bernard Daly's Promise, The Enduring Legacy of a Place-Based Scholarship. And this was a scholarship that I had received along with 22 other people in the year that I graduated, which was 2001. And Sam was interviewing recipients of this scholarship over the years to see how we were impacted and just to learn more about us in general. And he had talked first with a girl named Sarah, who is also in my class, and then she suggested that he contact me, and I was more than willing to be interviewed and to help him with his project. Also because he told me he was a bike tourist, so, he convinced me pretty easily because I also am a huge fan of bike touring and bicycles in general. And that's how I found myself being interviewed by Sam and being a part of this chapter of his book. Now, if you're wondering what the heck this has to do with my podcast, bear with me. First of all, I want to make a big important announcement, which is that this podcast, which until now has been called Live from Suckville, is now officially renamed Magic, Medicine, and Mayhem to reflect more of the person that I am and where I'm going. So in a sense, this podcast is evolving alongside me, which makes a lot of sense to me because life itself is change and evolution. And why in this exact moment am I finally coming out with a new podcast? Well, first of all, because I miss it. And second of all, because it's almost the summer solstice. Specifically, it's on Thursday, the 20th of June. And this podcast comes out just 2 days earlier. And the importance of this will be a bit clearer later on as well. So in these months of silence, as I've been marinating on a new name, because of a podcast course that I had listed in called Podcast Moguls, led by Nikayla Matthews Okome, who has a really amazing podcast called Side Hustle Pro. And I can tell you that this podcast course is a doozy because it's made me not only rethink the podcast, but pretty much everything. I've had to get really serious and intentional about what it is that I, Sylva Florence, and only I, can give to the world. In a sense, what is the specific personal magic and medicine that I bring to the mayhem of this world? And for some reason, I started looking through this final copy of the chapter that I was in Sam Stern's book, and I started reading about what he wrote about me. Basically, he'd done this nice little summary of my life. And there's just something interesting that happens when you read about yourself and your life in third person. You start to realize in this unique new way, what it actually is to be you. And as I was rereading this excerpt written by Sam, which really only skims the surface of all the craziness that I've put myself through, it really solidified something which had been already coming into picture through this course, which was the fact that I have so many varied life experiences to share and so many lessons that have come from all of them. And through it all has been this really deep, profound connection with nature that has become so integral in the work that I do today. And so ironically, it was rereading a story that someone else had written about my life that helped confirm the fact that storytelling was the way forward for me with this podcast. Everything that I want to do with this podcast going forward is a form of storytelling that I just hadn't thought of yet. Stories from nature that apply to your life. Stories from the walks and bike rides that I go on, in which nature itself tells its own story. It's almost like, duh, Sylva, did you really have to go through a podcast course to realize this? I mean, it's why I was attracted to journalism. It's why I've had a blog for more than 10 years. It's why I started this podcast in the end. It's why I have boxes and boxes of journals with me in Italy and one still at my parents' house in Utah. Other than nature, stories have been the common thread weaving through my life. Actually, I have a quote on my podcast website from J.K. Rowling's Albus Dumbledore, Harry Potter, if anybody else is a fan. And he says, "Words are, in my not so humble opinion, our most inexhaustible source of magic." And I am 100% in agreement with you, Albus. So without further ado, I'm going to read to you this excerpt from Sam's book, which will give you a bit of let's say, a taste of what's to come. Because as I said, it just skims the surface of all of the stories that I have to tell you and all of the wisdom that's hidden in those stories, because each of us has so much wisdom in our own stories, which is why I'm still, alongside everything else that I'm going to add to this podcast, there are still going to be interviews with ordinary humans with extraordinary stories of overcoming trauma and adversity. So settle in, grab a tea, a coffee, a glass of wine, depending on what time of the day it is for you, and get comfortable. I'm just going to read you what Sam wrote. Sylva Florence, who graduated with the aforementioned Sarah and Jackie, who was another one of my classmates, might have the biggest and most challenging job of the three. She has to keep up with herself, and that's not easy to do, as she throws herself into one adventure after another. As with Sarah and Jackie, it all started in Lakeview, which is in Southern Oregon, where Sylva grew up, went to school, and fell in love with singing and writing. She followed the music to Southern Oregon University, where she started off as an opera major, but soon switched to journalism. Toward the end of her first year of college, she decided, at the last minute, to participate in the National Student Exchange. Since it was late in the process, she had to choose among the few remaining colleges with journalism programs. That's how Sylva found her way to Indiana University of Pennsylvania, IUP. After a year there, Sylva transferred to James Madison University in Virginia, where she continued her journalism studies, and as she did at IUP, served as an editor of the student newspaper. Sylva graduated in 2005, 3 colleges, and she still finished in 4 years through a combination of hard work and the push of the scholarship requirement. And if I'm not mistaken, this push that he's talking about is that you had 4 years of scholarship, so you had to finish in 4 years. Kind of kept you on track. Not wanting to stay on the East Coast, Sylva found a job fighting fires in Dillon, Colorado. While living in Colorado, she did a lot of different things, often several at a time. She was a backcountry snow ranger, wilderness ranger, Starbucks barista, bartender, airport luggage handler, van driver, nanny, and freelance writer. On top of all that, beginning in 2009, she went to Italy each year to lead bike tours for American and Canadian cyclists. As she wrote about in one of her blog entries, I was logging 60 to 70 hours a week at 2 jobs to save up for whatever was next. What came next was a solo, self-supported cycling trip across the United States. On her own for a little more than 4 months, Sylva rode her bike over 4,000 miles from Berkeley, California to St. Augustine, Florida. Riding across the South in 2017, the year after the polarizing election of 2016, must have been quite an experience. As she wrote, "Turns out, I undertook a rather timely experience. During the era of Me Too, I traveled across the USA as a solo female. Simultaneously, I threaded through areas of our very divided country, like the South, that many Americans view as unfriendly and unwelcoming. However, I discovered a very different America, a kind, welcoming America across the board. After a close-up view of her own country, Sylva packed up and moved to Faenza, a smallish city in north-central Italy, where she lives in a building that dates back to the 1300s. I'm now in Tuscany, but it was an amazing place to live. In Italy, Sylva is again juggling several different jobs, freelance editing and translation, working on a book about her cross-country bike trip, teaching English online to Chinese children in China, and teaching English to Italians in Italy. She may be far from home, but the feel of the Lake County landscape is with her. An entry from her blog. In Italy, very little actual wildlands remain. Even in the north, where the jagged Dolomites challenge Italians to cultivate steep slopes, many still manage to do so. It's common to hike up avalanche paths and steep valleys for hours, only to run into a rancher in a mud-splattered Fiat Panda tending to his sheep. As such, it's a challenge for an American like me, who grew up next to the wilderness, to find solitude. But when the trail winds on and off of this old dirt road, even though the road itself is evidence of human impact, the feeling of remoteness is achieved. The sounds of traffic have faded, and only on weekends do hikers make it past the panoramic ridge. A distant dwelling might break up the forest, but it's mostly a big puzzle of mountains, cloud, and sky. I find it incredibly fitting as well, and Sam wouldn't have necessarily known this, but I find it very, very fitting that his summary of me ends on a description of wildness and solitude. And by now I'm sure that you've noticed that aside from storytelling, which is inherent in podcasting in general, that nature is going to be a huge protagonist in magic, medicine, and mayhem. You see, there's a lot of talk these days about reconnecting with nature. But what does that actually mean? What does that mean to you if you're not somebody who would grab their tent and water filter and head into the forest for 3 days? What if you don't even have a garden? What if you live in a city? What if bugs and creepy crawlers just totally gross you out? Or the idea of going out in nature alone kind of scares you? This is where I come in, because the truth is that the wisdom of nature is accessible to everyone, because nature is a very generous teacher. It's just that some of us have forgotten how to listen or how to find this wisdom. And I'm here to help with that, to be a bridge between nature and modern day humans. Do you also remember how I said that one of the reasons why I'm finally coming out with a new podcast episode is because it's near the summer solstice? I would like my business and my podcast to follow seasonal natural patterns, which is also why I've chosen to have my free newsletter, which I call the Crescent Moon Letter, come out every waxing crescent moon. Why the waxing crescent moon? Because at this point in the moon's cycle, it's growing and gaining strength again after a period of rest and rebirth even, growing towards the full moon. And I like the cyclical nature of that idea. And just like that reposing moon, I'm going to be taking a long vacation to go back to the United States in the month of August and the first part of September, after which I'm going to return inspired and refreshed and ready to start with a brand new podcast schedule of 4 podcasts a week, plus the free and then a paid newsletter with all sorts of amazing resources and tools to help you get even more in touch with your inner nature and nature itself. And the exciting launch of this new podcast and the offerings that come with it will be timed for the fall solstice, which is an incredible time for letting go, for celebrating the harvest, and for preparing for winter. And I'll give you plenty of ways to do all of those as well. In the meantime, however, I would like to give you a taste of what's to come. So there will be a total of 2 episodes this month and then 2 episodes next month before I shove off for America. So next week, in honor of Pride Month, we're going to study and learn from the mysterious little frog. The frog, which is, among other things, an amazing transformer, so represents transformation and growth, and is a sign, a symbol of support and inclusivity for the LGBTQ plus community. And I don't talk about it too often, but it doesn't mean that it's not important. The fact that I too am a part of this amazing rainbow community of humans as a bisexual woman. So in talking about the frog, I'll be also honoring that part of myself and my connection to that community, of which I am very proud. So this is going to be a monthly feature in general, in which we have an animal, plant, or tree teacher called Sylvology 101. And we're going to examine a little bit of the science. What does it need to survive? Where does it live? And then we're going to move into how does that apply to your life? For example, in the rainbow community, the frog stands for the transformation that takes place when you start to accept yourself just as you are, without trying to fit in to what society wants. And this, I think, is a beautiful message and a beautiful metaphor for anyone, whether you're LGBTQ plus or not. And I honestly can't think of a better spot to leave it, because the whole point of all of this is that each of you is more and more authentic, because that's what this world needs, is more of exactly who you are, naturally. And if this show inspires just 1 or 2 of you to do just that, then it's all been worth it. So I give you permission from this moment forward to go out into the mayhem and give the world your unique story. Thanks for listening to Magic, Medicine, and Mayhem. If you like this podcast, please subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts. This helps others like you who want to get in touch with nature and their inner nature find this podcast. If you want to hear more from me, you can follow me on Instagram at Sylva_Florence and at Magic, Medicine, and Mayhem. To receive podcasts, reminders, updates, announcements, freebies, and more, you can go to www.sylvaflorence.com and sign up for the free Crescent newsletter. Until next time.